It's an honor and a pleasure to join each of you in a dialogue about my recently published book, Chained in Silence: Black Women and Convict Labor in the New South. Black women and girls, for that matter, are and always have been over-policed, over-incarcerated, and underprotected. They are just as hyper-visible to police today as they were during the post-Civil War period, and they are equally vulnerable to state-sanctioned violence and mass incarceration. Sadly, the culture of silence that exists around these issues is no less pervasive and perpetual now than it was in the past. The overemphasis on the plight of the Black male in the U.S. injustice system and their experiences of state violence has resulted in the obscuring of Black women's experiences of mass imprisonment and violence. Their cries have been and are still being drowned out amid the deafening defense of Black manhood. It is almost as if Black women's lives don't matter. The seemingly negligible numbers of Black women locked up and beat down by the state when compared with Black men has been used as an excuse to justify their erasure. The same is true when unarmed Black women are murdered by the police. The purpose of my talk today is to contextualize this issue, ensuring that the voices of working class incarcerated Black women are clearly heard and their histories understood. Chained in Silence functions as a window into the present. It reveals to us that Black female mass incarceration and gendered racial violence is not a new development. It is part of a long-standing practice that has existed since the end of the Civil War. I was inspired to write this book because I wanted to make Black women visible and legible, to tell the full story of Black women's lives and labors after emancipation. I wanted to dismantle widely held assumptions about imprisoned women's reduced worth and profitability when compared with Black men. Chained in Silence was written as a corrective to the male-centric, uneven rendering of the history of convict leasing and the chain gang system. It was my way of moving working-class incarcerated Black women and girls' lives, labors, travails, and fleeting triumphs from the margin to the center of historical discourse, accounting for the prominent role they played in rebuilding the physical and economic infrastructure of the war-torn South. Reaching to the outermost margins of history to salvage the voices of the forgotten, this was my way of reclaiming lesser-known, less respectable Black women whose burdens and tribulations have been left unaccounted for. In order to tell these stories, I had to dig deep. I mined 8 archives, hundreds of 19th century newspaper articles, manuscripts, clemency applications, misdemeanor chain gang monthly reports, prison camp hospital registers, annual and biennial reports of the Prison Commission, whipping reports, census records, court transcripts, prison physicians' reports, and even oral testimonies to reconstruct this history, which were rare and slim in number. And each record revealed something different about the day-to-day realities these women fared. Clemency applications, for example, gave me a glimpse into the medical struggles incarcerated women experienced. I discovered that many inmates were sick and dying at the point of their clemency, and that they were only released because they were no longer viable. Through these records, I also witnessed the desperation and dedication on the part of family members and sympathetic petitioners who wrote in on these women's behalf, advocating for their release. Newspaper articles, which were vital to this study, provided missing details to this fragmented history. By using these sources and reading them against the official record, I was able to get a much fuller story. The names, dates, locations, details of events, and other specific facts that couldn't be determined from other sources were found in abundance in racist editorials. And these facts checked out when compared with official sources. Through the use of conservative white newspapers that hyperbolized and pathologized Black female criminality, I was able to get rare evidences, including statements from female convicts, which were unavailable elsewhere. Whipping reports, an administrative instrument used to inventory the acts of violence and terror meted out against insubordinate male and female inmates in Georgia's convict lease camps, played an equally important role in helping me to understand the ways in which violence impacted the lives of Black female convicts. Whipping bosses, as they were called, hired by lessees and endorsed by the state, meticulously notated every stroke and every stripe tendered by the lash, and they cited the name of every wrongdoer and the content of his or her misdeeds. But these narratives of cruelty and suffering actually served an important additional function. I found that examining the types of offenses for which bondwomen were punished, as opposed to scrutinizing the processes of punishment alone, by doing that, I was better able to ascertain the habits of dissent cultivated among female incarcerees. An intellectual investment and commitment to telling these women's stories was my primary motivation for writing Chained in Silence. But there's a more personal reason why I wrote this book. I am the great-granddaughter of Georgia sharecroppers who lived and labored under the fog of Jim Crow and weathered the same climate of terror as the women I write about. My great-grandfather, Leon Johnson, was born in 1903 in LaGrange. My great-grandmother, Leola, who you see pictured here, was born in 1904 in a town appropriately called Rough Edge. I wrote about Grandma Leola in the prologue to Chained in Silence, and I'd like to share those reflections with you now. So in the prologue, which is entitled Between Sound and Silence, I write, "This book is an effort to give voice to a group that has been too long silent. There was no greater inspiration for this effort than memories of my great-grandmother, a woman of quiet dissemblances, meaningful pauses, and reticence when it came to sharing too much about the past. Born in 1904 in Troup County, Georgia, to a family of sharecroppers, Grandma Leola had a mental strongbox filled with memories. Though occasionally she would unfetter her recollections and reveal the details of her life, there was much about her youth that never left that sacred container. As a young girl, I spent many Saturday afternoons at my great-grandparents' charming little house on Harvest Lane. I would whiz through the front gate with my mother trailing behind and make my way to the front porch where Grandma, as we called her, lose the D, would be sitting on a sun-bleached wooden bench scouting the purty cars, rowdy chillins, and strangers passing by. Among the neighborhood folks, she was renowned for her ability to wield an axe like a samurai, wring a chicken's neck with half a twist, turn fried meat with her bare hands, and flip blazing hot cornbread into her leathery palms without scalding her flesh, and you certainly didn't want her to give you a spanking. I never got spankings from Grandma Leola. Our greetings were always the same. "Hi, Grandma." "Hi, baby." Next, she would bend down to hug me. Her skin looked and felt like chocolate pudding, and her powder-scented dresses gave off a faint scratching sound whenever she moved. Then I would tiptoe past her snuff can and spit bucket and take a seat on the bench. Now and then, Grandma would reach into her heart and offer me a tiny morsel of her life history. I enjoy watching the light come into Grandma's eyes as she proudly spoke about birthing all 13 of them chillins, or of the days my great-grandfather spent making a fool out of himself trying to woo her. She would say, "Your grandpa was a pretty man. All them gals wanted him, but not me." Then an earthquake of laughter would shake her entire body. But when I would ask what it was like coming of age, in Rough Edge, a rural farming town on the outer edge of LaGrange, Georgia, all of that joy would vanish. A vulnerability would enter into her eyes. She would run her wide fingertips across her wrinkled forehead, and in a low, serious tone, she would say things like, "Child, them white folks was something else in my day. Couldn't cross them tracks after dark." Mama, Jessie Lee, Sally Fanny, and Willie, her older siblings, worked hard in the fields because my daddy gone dead. Her father died when she was around 5 years old. Me and Horace got us some schooling, though. I got real good with my reading and writing, then I had to start helping out. We was real po', but when we got grown, we got us some families, and we ain't never getting no trouble. No, sir. On this subject, Grandma Leola was never quite clear. Her sentences broke off and ran together, forcing me to read between obscure lines to understand her. When she died at age 95, she left me with more questions than answers. What unnamed indignities had she endured at the hands of Southern white folkses? Why did she so esteem her reproductive power and find it essential to publicly reinscribe her femininity by conceiving and birthing many children? Why, despite the racial and gendered barriers strewn in her path, did she dare to hope literacy would improve her ability to maneuver the rough terrain of poverty and exclusion? Why did she endorse a strict code of respectability almost exclusively steeped in obedience to law and order? And why did the specter of white racial hostility, violence, terror, and legal subjugation bewilder her recollections, causing her to conceal certain segments of the past? In writing this book, I've studied my great-grandmother's pain and come face to face with more than a handful of excruciating truths. I found that Troup County, Georgia, the place Grandma Leola called home, was the headquarters for the worst chain gang in Georgia. It was a place where, quote, fearless, hardened men from other camps who had escaped and were recaptured, and those who were without friends or political aid were brutalized for not keeping the lick. Among these men was Robert Burns, a white northern miscreant whose classic expose, I am a fugitive from a Georgia chain gang, revealed one part of the human tragedy taking place in Grandma Leola's backyard, but not all of it. The other side of that calamity forms the subject of this book. In 1932, the year Burns' memoir was published, 5 black women were sentenced to hard labor on the Troup County chain gang. Nearly 200 others were forced to toil in labor camps scattered throughout the state of Georgia. For nearly a century, the specter of mass imprisonment haunted black Georgians, women included. Respectable ladies like Grandma Leola, as well as the more rebellious echelon of Freedom's daughters, were all burdened by Southern injustice. They coexisted in a milieu where the threat of incarceration was omnipresent. Thus, Chained in Silence is as much an attempt to excavate the memories Grandma Leola dared to forget as it is an opportunity to give voice to the women still waiting to be heard. Off the grid, tucked away in flying railroad camps, brickyards, chain gangs, lumber mills, mines, plantations, stockades, kitchens, wash houses, barns, and big houses, thousands of African American women prisoners lived, labored, suffered, and died. Under the supervision of temperamental guards, also referred to as whipping bosses, they worked from sunup to sundown, grading surfaces for railroads, laying tracks, mining clay, firing bricks, digging ditches, smelting iron, building roads, chopping down trees, harvesting turpentine, plowing fields, hoeing weeds, and picking crops. Some had the added burden of cooking meals, cleaning camp quarters, laundering acres of soiled linens and garments, or even working as the private servants of lessees, wardens, and other authorities. The indiscriminate work arrangements that evolved in Georgia's post-war prison camps were a partial derivative of the Old South plantation regime. In the antebellum period, planters established a promiscuous pattern of utilizing female slaves in masculine modes of field labor. The most athletic members of the female sex were sometimes forced to dig ditches, cut trees, and haul lumber. Although the convict leasing paradigm embodied some tenuous aspects of plantation slavery, including the ungendering of bondwomen's labor to satisfy fluctuating financial and work-related needs, lessees decisively prioritized heavy manual work as the status quo, not the exception. And much of this had to do with the decline of black women's reproductive worth after slavery. Lessees, unlike slaveholders, had no financial incentive to preserve the fertility of their rented chattel, and cared little if women were rendered sterile or suffered gynecological complications as a result of the extreme and heavy labor they were forced to perform. And I'll speak a little bit more about this concept of what I call menacing reproduction. In short, the convict lease system disrupted antebellum labor practices and ushered in a new definition of African American women's work. So, although you don't see women pictured here, dozens of African American women prisoners worked the rails of New South Georgia. And Georgia's railroad system was actually the first industry to experiment with the use of black female prison labor, and prison labor in general. In 1869, the Atlanta-based contracting firm of Grant Alexander and Company had in its possession 17 female convicts, all of whom were former slaves. Born into bondage, Mary Brooks enjoyed 3 years of freedom before she was restored to a lifetime of involuntary servitude. In March 1868, at the tender age of 16, she was convicted of murder by a Bartow County judge and sentenced to natural life in the walls of the state penitentiary where she worked as a domestic. 1 year later, Brooks and 12 other female inmates traded in their sewing machines, cooking utensils, and wash tubs for pickaxes, carts, and shovels. By 1874, roughly 32 women had been farmed out to the Macon and Augusta, Brunswick and Albany, and airline railroads. In the railroad camps operated by William Grant and Thomas Alexander, female convicts did the same work as men did in the cuts, where they graded surfaces for railroads, drove carts, and shoveled dirt. In the absence of modern technology, the work had to be done in a time-consuming process that required great strength and dexterity that many women just did not have. Graders milled miles of terrain, while cart drivers helped load large pieces of rock and debris in a wheelbarrow, then rolled it up the dirt rock heap of the cuts. The tough grind of railroad construction lasted from sunup to sundown, leaving female prisoners desperately exhausted and unable to churn out more labor. Weak women workers were sometimes flogged and, quote, hit with rocks that would knock them speechless as a way of stimulating greater productivity in the workplace. At the Camp Hurd-Mott Prison Plantation in Elbert County, Georgia, which you see pictured here in a sketch, was the first centralized female prison camp established in the state. William Henry, the leasee, employed a three-tiered approach to convict leasing, which was industrial, agricultural, and domestic in nature. At his camp, women prisoners plowed fields, sowed crops, paddled through rivers of cotton, ran grist mills, ginned cotton, forged iron, cooked meals, cleaned camp quarters, and washed soiled garments. They also felled trees and sawed lumber. Lumberjacking was an extremely dangerous and unsparing occupation, ordinarily restricted to strong, practiced men. Inexpert at the trade and in many instances lacking the physical power to fell the trees or maneuver their limp torsos, female convicts were often severely wounded. Some were crushed by falling logs, while others were dismembered by misdirected axe blades or aggrieved by the pain of dislocated bones and muscle tears. Rose Henderson understood firsthand the dangers lurking in the pine forest. On March 19, 1896, the lumber woman was, quote, hurt by a falling tree and laid up in the camp hospital for 6 days before being driven back into the forest. And this information comes from hospital registers where, inmates that had been injured or gave birth in the prison camp hospital, which I'll talk a little bit more about, were listed. In a similar instance, 44-year-old Sarah Johnson was nearly crushed to death by a fallen tree. After the accident, Johnson spent close to 1 month convalescing in the camp infirmary. Eliza Randall, a convicted murderess, as they were called, was put in charge of running the sawmill, cotton gin, and performing half of the blacksmithing work for the farm. Overwork, while not unique to incarcerated women's experiences, was her punishment for transgressing racial boundaries and defying the code of white supremacy. Before arriving at Camp Hurd-Mott, Randall engaged in an affair with a white male prison guard at another camp and became pregnant with his child. Approximately 1 month after arriving at Camp Hurd-Mott, Eliza Randall gave birth. Her baby was the first of 3 children born in the prison camp hospital. It was also the first to die. Soon after taking its first breath, Randall's baby was carried to a river and plunged into a liquid grave. On the word of Bud Hilly, a former guard at the camp, quote, "On more than one occasion, a convict would give birth. No time could be spared for a nursing mother, so on Maddox's standing order, the newborn was simply taken into the river and thrown in," end quote. Amid the countless examples of gendered violence and exploitation that litter the Southern prison archive, Eliza Randall's case most profoundly demonstrates the effects of what I call menacing reproduction on the lives of incarcerated Black women. It was during the post-emancipation period that Black women's wombs lost their worth, and their productive labor was intensely commodified. Whereas the viability of the Southern plantation economy rested on enslaved women's capacity to produce labor and laborers, post-Civil War penal regimes viewed pregnancy and childbirth as deterrents to economic progress. This is best illustrated through the act of killing infants born in prison camps and the prioritization of heavy manual labor, which resulted in the wounding and permanent impairment of imprisoned Black women's reproductive bodies. And this is not new either. If we think about the crisis facing pregnant mothers in prison today and how they're oftentimes, forced to give birth without any medical care or medical assistance for that matter, and the fact that they oftentimes give birth to stillborn children or their lives are left in peril in the process. Essentially, this is the beginning of that long history of menacing reproduction or the assault on Black women's reproductive bodies and maternity. As if the unremitting slog of hard labor or watching one's child be killed or waste away from starvation while she's working, hard labor in the state's camps, as if that was not unbearable enough, Black female prisoners were routinely tormented by violence. Some were flogged in public acts of humiliation and torture, while others were crammed into wooden solitary confinement chambers like the one you see pictured here that varied little from sweat boxes used to punish the enslaved. But brazen physical violence was only one part of a twofold assault on Black women's humanity. Female convicts were inordinately susceptible to shameless attacks on their sexuality. The whip, a weapon of terror first deployed against the enslaved, was reintroduced in Southern prison camps after the Civil War. Whipping bosses, again, were hired by private lessees with permission from the state to enforce discipline among convicts and to energize fatigued workers. Any prisoner that slacked in his or her labor duties, squabbled with other inmates, physically or verbally challenged camp authorities, or dared test the bounds of white supremacy were, quote, whipped with a rawhide until the blood ran down. Some bosses went one step further by combining flogging with the practice known as bucking, a carryover from antebellum days where a victim was stripped and forced to lay bound across a log upon which a whipping would be carried out. As the processes of brutality became more advanced, some opted for the use of the bucking machine, which you see pictured here, a high-tech substitute for the antebellum style of bucking across a log. These carefully staged rituals were oftentimes performed in the presence of other inmates for the expressed purpose of showing off the rude power of the law. Although rarely documented, male convicts were sometimes forced to assist in acts of violence against female prisoners. These beatings were public performances staged in the presence of other inmates, male and female, to humiliate, demoralize, and terrorize abuse victims and frightened onlookers. Certain whipping bosses relied on the tool of communal violence to instigate feelings of intraracial and intergendered discourse and to create suspicion among Black detainees and to emasculate and disempower African American men. Although the effectiveness of this disciplinary strategy is uneasily verified, the initiative behind the action gives a sense of the ways in which violence was used to oppress all Black detainees, whether they were on the receiving end or witnesses of the violence. As a rule, African American women in the post-emancipation South were disentitled to the protections afforded to white women. Hence, the heightened devaluation of free Black womanhood, the overall societal exclusion of Southern Black women from the cult of true womanhood, together with the withdrawn incentive to preserve black life after slavery and the new presence of a highly regenerative penal system that legally sanctioned violence, helped foster brutality. As one former leasee explained, quote, "Before the war, we owned the Negroes, but these convicts, we don't own them. One dies, get another." This one dies, get another economic principle engendered and encouraged unabated forms of violence to persevere in the South's convict lease and chain gang camps. While it is important to account for the inexorable violence that circumscribed African American women's lived and laboring experiences in Georgia's post-bellum prison camps, it is equally necessary to analyze the uniquely gendered ways in which women prisoners experienced violence. Like the whip, rape became a potent weapon of terror used to terrorize, punish, torture, and exact power over female subjects. Unfortunately, antebellum notions about the unrapeability of black women were superimposed onto the postbellum legal landscape and the social landscape, allowing white men to sexually terrorize African American women prisoners unchecked by the law. And I've never seen in the entire historical record one instance where a prison guard or a whipping boss or a leasee or a prison doctor, all of whom took turns with incarcerated women in terms of subjecting them to sexual violence, prosecuted for these offenses. Alongside power, enduring notions of black female licentiousness and immorality encouraged the continuation of sexual abuse. During the period of slavery, a mythology of black female sexuality was contrived that equated the enslaved woman's body with promiscuity. Antebellum Southerners advanced the notion that female slaves were, quote, lewd and lascivious. Any refusal to yield during a sexual attack was considered, quote, mere feigning. Hence, prison camp authorities took liberties with female inmates based on these same long-standing racialized assumptions. Beyond the overt act of rape, floggings also bordered on the sexual, as is reflected in the practice of forcefully stripping female captives. But even the physical posturing of male assailants during these attacks was also sexualized in nature. In one Georgia railroad camp, a female prisoner was reportedly, quote, whipped with her clothes pulled over her head with the overseer standing on them, with her head between his knees, and he was whipping her on her naked butt, end quote. The physical and sexual violence imposed upon imprisoned black women left indelible somatic, psychological, and emotional injuries. In Chained in Silence, I put forth an attempt to narrate the survivor's pain and to explore the physical and psychological dimensions of abuse on the incarcerated black female body. Undergirding this intellectual decision is historian Deborah Gray White's charge to pursue with rigor the violence levied against black women as a way to decenter lynching as the principal site and foremost expression of white sexual anxiety on the black body. The imprisoned black female body was a living, breathing montage of African American women's suffering. It was decorated with cuts, scratches, broken bones, bruises, and lacerations left by the whip. The type and placement of one's scars told a sad and harrowing story. Bruises and scratches on the abdomen, torso, and lower body likely reflected one's attempt to fight off a sexual attack. Lash marks scored into the delicate skin of a woman's back are demonstrative of the fury with which whipping bosses express their superlative authority over quote-unquote unruly, quote-unquote lazy, quote-unquote disobedient subjects. Cuts and broken bones are another indicator of the brutal violence used to extricate the maximum labor possible and to terrorize female victims into submission. The lasting effects of unchecked physical violence were multifarious. Some women were permanently maimed, while others died from their injuries. In January 1904, a 14-year-old girl was sentenced to the Bibb County chain gang in central Georgia, near Macon, for larceny. 6 months after her confinement, the adolescent was sent home to die. As stated by social reformer Clarissa Olds Keeler, the, quote, scars on the girl's body corroborated her dying testimony that she had been, quote, whipped to death. The verdict of the coroner's jury was, quote, her death was the result of cruel treatment after she died. Like physical scars, emotional injuries caused by rape left a permanent imprint on the mind and spirit of female victims. Rape survivors were almost certainly afflicted with a multitude of psychosomatic challenges that can be best understood in modern terms. While one must be cautious not to project 21st century knowledge onto a late 19th and early 20th century historical situation, contemporary research does provide new ways of understanding the psychological impact of sexual violence on female victims. Because of the lack of available historical evidence, the only way to attempt to account for the ways in which rape or physical violence affected Southern African American women prisoners is to use present-day scientific research. So that's what I did. Not unlike most rape victims in particular, imprisoned women likely suffer from anxiety, depression, withdrawal, insomnia, flashbacks, nightmares, low self-esteem, and a host of other medical problems. In extreme cases, some sufferers may have experienced long-term sexual disorders, such as hypoactive sexual desire disorder, which is a chronic lack of interest in sexual activity, or sexual aversion disorder, which is a phobic avoidance of sexual contact with an intimate partner. It was not unheard of for a formerly enslaved woman who was raped by her master or forced to couple or breed with another slave to put off marriage or abstain from sexual relations with the opposite sex for the remainder of her life. The same may also be true of formerly incarcerated women, although there are no autobiographical accounts or oral testimonies that exist to support this assertion. Beyond the issues cited above, the pain of sexual violence likely engendered other somatic and psychological responses. It is possible that some victims turned their suffering inward, shielding the extent of their anguish from public view and choosing not to share their inner feelings with the outside world. These women may have employed the art of dissemblance, a term used by historian Darlene Clark Hine to describe the manner in which some Black women adapted their behavior and attitudes to create an appearance of transparency and disclosure, while actually shielding the truth of their inner lives from their oppressors as a coping mechanism. Some may have also experienced denial or purposely blocked out the traumatizing episodes in an effort to retain soundness of mind, which would have been paramount to one's ability to survive her remaining years or months or lifetime in bondage. Others probably found relief by doing just the opposite. For some, sharing the details of a painful event to a trusted party and gaining emotional support from another victim of sexual violence could have functioned as a powerful mode of therapy. Unfortunately, we may never know the full extent to which African American women coped with their post-assault suffering, but we most certainly must ask these questions. In spite of the rough assault on their bodies, pride, and personhood, incarcerated women forged a unique culture of dissent in response to the power structure of the penal system, and like other subordinate groups, made use of private and public techniques of subversion. Bondwomen malingered, disobeyed orders, set fires, ran away, fought camp guards, cursed their superiors, and destroyed property. Each act of resistance administered by a female captive, whether large or small, individual or collective, was a hopeful gesture toward preserving her self-worth within an inhumane system built on terror and control. The methods of resistance besieged by women prisoners are quite similar to the strategies utilized by female slaves. For some Black female captives in the post-emancipation South, malingering was a proficient tool of opposition, particularly among field workers, like the ones you see pictured here. The act of working slowly, sloppily, or avoiding work altogether was done in an attempt to undercut the lessee's earnings and to undermine the profitability of the carceral state. Moreover, African American women prisoners sidestepped their duties as a conscious rejection of their chattel status or rented chattel status. Case in point, in Jefferson County, Georgia, Mary Puckett, a convicted arsonist, life-term felon, and former slave, was put in charge of plowing the fields of the Old Town plantation. She had the capability to razor through the fields with the adroitness of a man and to command her mule like a drill sergeant. But instead, she opted to play clumsy and shirk her duties. As a consequence, she was flogged multiple times for, quote, bad plowing and, quote, neglect of work. And this is documented in the whipping reports that I mentioned earlier. In a similar instance, 20-year-old Laura Johnson, a convicted burglaress, was flogged 3 times in less than 1 week for failure to work. While most female convicts used acts of day-to-day resistance in their attempts to thwart the state-sponsored attack on their self-worth, others made more dramatic displays of their discontent. They ran away. Some absconded in hopes of securing freedom from overwork. Others fled physical and or sexual abuse and tyranny. Women like Maddie Crawford, on the other hand, used public and private acts of resistance to help sustain themselves in their journey through unfreedom's wild territory. The picture that you see here is a woman named Maddie Crawford. Maddie Crawford was convicted of murder in 1896 and sentenced to a lifetime in the Georgia penitentiary system, and was sent to the to the Chattahoochee Brick Company, where she was forced to work mining clay, making bricks, and working as a blacksmith. In my view, Maddie Crawford's decision to learn the blacksmith trade was an act of self-preservation, not a conscious disavowal of her womanhood. On the contrary, I believe she valued her femininity and put up a fight to preserve it. It is important to mention that Crawford actually began her blacksmithing apprenticeship wearing dresses. But according to prison officials, quote, with her skirts being in the way, the guards forced her to put on the trousers. Several whippings were necessary to make her consent to this, and this is on the word of a guard. Unable to physically resist her captors' attempts to defeminize her, Crawford resorted to the use of a different resistance technique. She performed masculinity and took advantage of the perks afforded her. Yet within, she may have secretly affirmed her womanhood, using her proficiency as an ironsmith as a measurement of her own feminine identity, without trading it in for exclusively for a male one. In prison for a lifetime, Crawford also opted to use her skills to temporarily liberate herself from the physical and symbolic constraints of prison life. Just the same, by embracing masculine garb and practicing male-oriented labor, she contested the imposed heterosexual violence levied against the black female body. While male clothing certainly did not make an African-American woman impervious to sexual assault, it is quite possible that Crawford used her dress and vocation as a blacksmith to redirect the gaze of her captors and to refashion the way in which her body was framed by her keepers and the system as a whole. In essence, she bent her gender identity in the same way that she bent the iron for the sake of survival. For the sake of context, I think it's important to note that the demeaning assault on black femininity through dress and labor was one of many methodologies used to punish female captives, to reinforce racial subordination and gendered inferiority, and to offset the strides black women made to have their womanhood acknowledged after the Civil War. Prevailing notions of femininity and the security that, quote, proper women deserve were intertwined with whiteness and generally denied to women of color. White Southerners disparaged freed women's attempts to, quote, play the lady. Thus, the burning of clothes became a way in which some African-American women prisoners reclaimed their bodily integrity. While careful not to make gendered assumptions or to dismiss any notion that some bond women expressively benefited from wearing masculine garb, like Maddie Crawford, it is important to note again that male attire did not make a female prisoner immune to rape. Hence, a bondwoman's actions of burning men's clothes was one way of asserting her own body politic. Weighed down by imprisonment and all of its masculine accessories, Molly White and Nora Daniel was among those who exhibited their frustrations by setting their garments ablaze at the Chattahoochee Brickyard. The whipping boss punished the young women on 2 separate occasions, rendering them 10 lashes apiece in each instance for, quote, burning shirts and, quote, burning clothes. Understanding their material value to the lessee and the intricate connection between uniforms and the production of labor, these female convicts were symbolically destroying the lessee's property to undermine orderly attempts toward reducing them into subjects of profit and to satisfy an internal desire to have their womanhood and humanity recognized. For decades, Southern black women prisoners were beset by violence, terror, and unrelenting work demands. But despite their circumstances and setbacks, these women did not surrender their will to survive. Inspired by the grit and power of all of slavery's mothers and freedom's daughters, these women rejected their role as quote-unquote working beasts or sexual bodies and actively engaged in the struggle to preserve their self-dignity. Notwithstanding these limited victories, they clung to a fleeting hope that one day they would be liberated from social, economic, political, and gendered oppression and have their humanity acknowledged and affirmed. That same hope persists among the thousands of African-American black women, of the thousands of incarcerated black women today. May we all commit to unchaining their silence and making a clamorous defense of black womanhood. Their lives depend on it. Our lives depend on it. Thank you.